Hey everybody, and welcome to week 3 of our online enrichment and review period. Last week we put a focus on how history could help us today. And while we looked at a number of topics, we really focused in on the 1918 flu pandemic and saw how lessons from that could assist us in modern times. We also looked at primary sources and had a class discussion to wrap things up on Friday. Please feel free to revisit that class discussion and look at the posts that your classmates made and some of my responses, and also considering joining it as like a conversation where you could actually respond to their posts, ask questions, add details, and stuff like that. So last week we looked at one type of historic research in primary sources. What we're going to look at today is a different subfield of history known as public history. And basically this is the past on display, like it says on this slide here. Public history is a way for historic research to be communicated to the general public. And it takes a lot of different forms, right? It could happen in historic museums. Public history could be places such as battlefields. What you're seeing there in the picture isn't quite a battlefield, but it's the site, it's Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, which is the site of a famous winter encampment of George Washington's army during the Revolutionary War. And there's recreations of the buildings that would have been there, and it's a monument to the type of conditions in life that soldiers lived during the winter in Valley Forge. And it's on display for anybody to go and see. It's actually a National Historical Site. Statues of all different types of historic figures are considered public history, right? Things like the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C., or the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials there, as well as more local things like the statue of Christopher Columbus or Dan Flood on Public Square in Wilkes-Barre. Sometimes expressions of public history take more subtle forms, such as dedications of buildings and roads and bridges, right? The Pierce Street Bridge that connects Wilkes-Barre with Kingston is actually also known as Veterans Memorial Bridge, for instance, because it's commemorating veterans throughout American history. So sometimes expressions of public history are very, very obvious, while other times they're rather hidden in plain sight. Now, public history is sometimes controversial. Tomorrow we're actually going to focus on some controversies in public history surrounding these two monuments. Both of them have stirred up controversy in recent times. In the top left is a monument in Richmond, Virginia that shows Abraham Lincoln sitting on a bench with his son Tad to commemorate President Lincoln, first of all, plus a trip from with him and his son near the end of the American Civil War. In the lower right hand is a statue in Charlottesville, Virginia, of General Robert E. Lee, the commander of Confederate forces during the American Civil War. And both of these monuments have been very controversial in different times. Both of them have been celebrated by certain members of the general population, while other members of the population have called for both of these monuments to be removed or taken away. And as we get into tomorrow's lesson, we're going to discuss why, and we're going to look at a couple articles about these two monuments and look at the perspectives of various members of the population as to why these monuments should be celebrated or why these expressions of public history should not be there and not celebrated. And I don't want to get into that too much today because that will be more of tomorrow's lesson, but I'm just presenting this here just so you could think of perhaps for yourself some reasons or think back to things that you might have already learned about the controversy surrounding certain statues. Now, public history, like I said, is sometimes more subtle and it's all around us. So I want to kind of conclude the discussion of public history by talking about GAR Memorial High School in the Wilkes-Barre Area School District. Now, all of you have likely heard of GAR High School, but many of you probably don't know that GAR stands for Grand Army of the Republic. And just as those statues on the previous page are memorials to the American Civil War, the high school itself is also a bit of public history that stands as a memorial to the Civil War. The Grand Army of the Republic was a veterans organization that was prominent following the Civil War right up into the early 1900s, and GAR was built in the 1920s, while many to most of the veterans by that point of the American Civil War would have already passed away. There is still a handful, however, alive. And members of the Wilkes-Barre chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic wanted to build some sort of monument to the soldiers of the Civil War. And originally in the 1920s, they wanted to build that on Public Square, Wilkes-Barre, and they had this design for this grand monument right in the middle of Public Square, and the city of Wilkes-Barre said no. In the 20s, the city of Wilkes-Barre was a much busier place, and downtown Wilkes-Barre, being busy, had a very open design, where Public Square was this large open space where people could congregate, and the city council did not want a large monument blocking that open design of the city. The Wilkes-Barre Area School District, however, was on the brink of building a new school, and the idea became to dedicate the school to the Grand Army of the Republic, to the veterans of the Civil War. And when GAR was built in the mid-1920s, that's exactly what happened. It became GAR High School. Now, while the history of that might have been lost to most people or just not known by most people even living in the area, the streets surrounding GAR High School are also monuments to the Civil War that are even perhaps less noticeable. But if you look at the names of the street, for instance, the address of GAR High School is on Sherman Street, named after General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a Civil War general. If we look on the opposite side of GAR, you'll see Grant Street, named after Ulysses S. Grant, who would ultimately become the commander of all Northern forces during the Civil War. But if we look all around that part of Wilkes-Barre, the streets are almost entirely named after figures from the Civil War. And I encourage you to take a look at a map, see what you could find on Google Earth or Google Maps, and if you look at GAR and look at the streets next to it and find some of those names and then look them up, I think you'll find some interesting individuals that those streets were named for. Now, here's what we will be doing the next 2 days. Today and tomorrow, we're going to dive deeper into the field of public history. Right? We're going to look at ways that history has been commemorated for the general public. Right? Oftentimes, we look at books which are written not for the general public, but more for other historians. However, expressions of public history are generally written by, or not written by, but generally for just everyday people. You're going to complete the assignment today that's attached to the 4-6-20 announcement. And in this assignment, what you're going to do is take a virtual tour of either a history museum or a historical site, and there's several options there. And then once you do that, you're going to answer a few questions based on that. Tomorrow, we're going to examine some additional examples of controversy, right? We're going to look at those two statues, and then you're going to do a little bit of research and maybe find some additional controversy among expressions of public history. We'll also try to find some other examples of public history locally. The Wilkes-Barre area is filled with history, and some of it's easier to find than others, and some of it might be right in front of you without you even knowing it, and we'll see what you could find. Anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and have a great rest of your day.